Okay, everybody. So one of the things I wanted to make sure to include in this week is to check in a little bit about your next phase. So this is going to go through a little bit more about how we start crafting your rough draft of your introduction. Now, as we're going through this, I want you to keep in mind a few things. First of all, it's really important that you revisit your written and audio feedback from phase 2 just to kind of touch base on where you are with your individual project. And I also really would like for you to see if you can touch base with me during the next 2 weeks about where your project is and to make sure that we're communicating as you start working on phase 3. So please do take advantage of this time, these 2 weeks that you have, to really dig down and think about your project and where you are and communicating with me. So here's just a few general thoughts as we're going through and reorienting ourselves to this big project that we have to work on as we're transitioning from phase 2 to phase 3. So it's really important to make sure when you think about your individual project that your design and hypotheses are finalized. So make sure that those are really clear, and if you had any sort of feedback that indicated you needed to work a little bit on your design and hypotheses, just make sure you put in that work. As a reminder, your entire paper is hinged on using research to support your hypotheses. And so making sure that those are very clear and straightforward and are linked to your design is important. And once again, look at your feedback from phase 2 to reorient you a little bit to this project. I have also linked an article that I had put on Course Reserves called How to Write a Scientific Article. I don't remember the name of the article off the top of my head, but the reading should be up and it should be very easy for you to find. It's written by Daryl Bem. And as you're getting ready to write a little bit more involved for your rough draft, BEM is a really good resource for you to think about, once again, these things we've been talking about when it comes to structure and how to think and talk about summarizing other people's research coherently. One of the other things I just want to mention is that a pitfall that people can run into when they're summarizing research is to laundry list. Here's study 1, here's what they found, here's how it links to my hypotheses. Here's study 2, here's what they found, here's how it links to my hypotheses. Don't treat all your sources the same. We're going to go through that a little bit more in detail in our second week online. So keep your eyes open for that, but just kind of be thinking about that as you go. Don't treat each study the same when you are summarizing it. Also, laundry lists are kind of boring. Remember that every paragraph is going to have a purpose and that you need to have some sort of transition between your paragraphs. A classic mistake that people will make is they will start talking about the next paragraph while they're still in their previous paragraph. Start your transition at the start of your paragraph and use that to identify to the reader what the purpose of that paragraph is and make sure that it is smoothly tied in with the previous things that have come before it. So really think about your transitions at the start of your paragraph as a part of this particular writing phase to make sure that you're linking these things all together into a coherent whole. So let's go ahead and go through a little bit more about APA style citation. I'm going to have some APA style citation activities for you to do as we go through this process. And then there's also the how to cite source that you can look to. I also can highly recommend Purdue OWL, and there are links to that for you to look up citation information about APA style. When it comes to APA style, I'm going to be more persnickety about APA style for your rough draft in a way that I was not for your outline. Your outline was intended to be informal. I'm going to be paying attention to things like ampersands and commas. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So first of all, with APA style citation, you typically use last names only and the year of publication. No initials, no first names, just last names. You also want to put it in the order of authorship. Author order matters. We talked about this in class, but the first author has usually put the most work into the paper. So don't alphabetize within your citation. Keep it in the order that it's been listed in, because order matters. There's two different types of citations. The first is an in-text citation, where you're talking about the authors as a natural part of the sentence. So for example, if you say, this measure was developed by Smith and Kim, that's just a normal sentence that you might say where you're mentioning the author's names, once again, last names only. And then if you put the year in parentheses following, that would be a full citation. It includes the author's last names and year. You're set to go. Another type of citation is parenthetical. A parenthetical citation would be where you put the author's last names in parentheses at the end of a sentence. And then the end punctuation of that sentence would follow after the end parentheses. In this particular parenthetical citation, the author's last names are provided as well as the year. The author's names are separated from the year with a comma, and because there are two authors, I use an ampersand to separate the two of them. You might notice I spell out "and" in the in-text citation, and I use an ampersand to save on space for the parenthetical citation. And yes, I actually am going to look at that as part of your formatting. So just think about that a little bit as you're going through. When it comes to, before I forget, a general rule of thumb when it comes to how we think about parentheses is that you should be able to remove the parentheses and all of the text in between, and the sentence should still make grammatical sense. So if you cut out the parentheses, the sentence should still read as a full sentence. One of the things I would recommend that you do as you're working on your paper is do a final read through and skip over all the parts in parentheses, and just make sure that it still reads as a paper and that your sentences are complete. General rule of thumbs when it comes to multiple authors. When there are two authors, you cite them both each time. So each time I would cite Smith and Kim, I would cite both Smith and Kim. If there's 3 to 5 authors, you cite all of the author's last names the first time around. So for example, Smith, Kim, and Parrott. And then the second time around and every subsequent time, you would cite the first author's last name followed by et al. And yes, that period is important. This is Latin. It means and others. So I would use Smith et al., comma, 2009. If I was going to be citing Smith, Kim, and Parrott in subsequent citations. If there's more than 5, then you jump to the shortened version, the et al. Version, right from the start, because it can get really cumbersome to mention 10 author names in a row. And so this saves on space and makes it more readable. So if there's more than 5, you just go with a shortened citation each time. I'm going to have some examples available for you to go through, both in the quizzes for the Did I Get This portion, as well as, once again, the How to Cite an APA Style document, which I recommend you take a look at. So things to think about. We cite when we're summarizing another author's ideas, results, materials, or words. So we need to provide a marker to say, hey, this doesn't come from me, this came from another person. Oftentimes, we're good at recognizing that when we cite someone's words, we need to provide some sort of indication about where we got it from. But citation applies to all these other things too. So if you're mentioning someone else's scale, or if you're saying this is what this person found, or if you're saying here's what this person thinks about what causes envy, then you need to go ahead and cite them as a part of that summary. It's important to cite when you are distinguishing between sources. So for example, source A and source B, and you want it very clear which information comes from which source. And when you are distinguishing between your own ideas and other people's ideas. So citation can be used as a marker. Here's when I'm talking about this, here's when I'm talking about that. So For example, if the entire paragraph is about a single source and you spend that entire time just summarizing the source and you're not providing any original information that's your own insights or thoughts about it, then you cite the author once at the start and you don't have to cite every single sentence. Your job is done. But if your paragraph switches between two different sources or between the source and your own personal interpretation of that source, then you need to use your citation to mark when you're talking about the source and when you're talking about your own thoughts, or when you're talking about source A versus source B. So you cite as a form of tracking so that the reader can pay attention to what information comes from the source and what information is your own. So for example, in this particular example, the cited source is for the information in red. Envy often involves a sense of inferiority. And then I go off into my own ponderings. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume, and I might expand and connect to my own study or my own hypotheses. That's my own thoughts there, my own interpretation of those results, my own linkage between those results and my own ideas. So the connection between envy and inferiority comes from someone else, but the expansion of it is my own thoughts. So the source in green is me, if that makes sense at all. I tend to tell people you can always oversight and then dial it back later. So when in doubt, cite, and I will tell you if it's citing too much. Citing is just a good general practice, and starting off going overboard is fine. Let's talk a little bit about quotes. Quotes tend to be used sparingly, and I want you to really, really carefully consider whether you should be using quotes in your paper. This is rules of thumb for scientific writing, not for writing literary criticism or a journal article. I mean, a journalism piece that's a newspaper article, sorry, a newspaper article. This is about scientific writing. And with scientific writing, scientists tend not to quote. Think back to the papers that you've read so far. How many of them used quotes? The answer is probably not many. And if they did, it was probably only one or two quotes. I only quote very rarely in my own work. The only time I tend to quote is when the power of the original words needs to be carried through my piece. So for example, if an author had a very, very compelling example of what jealousy was. Someone said very movingly once, for example, we don't get jealousy when a partner of ours dies. We get it when they move their attention onto someone else. They said it much better than I did, which is why I quoted them when I talked about it, because their example was so powerful. I might also quote external sources. So for example, when I'm talking about jealousy, I can quote Othello as an illustration of jealousy. That's very powerful. And I don't want to summarize Othello. I want to use his original words because they have a lot of oomph behind them. So quotations can be incredible examples, but you want to be very picky about when you use quotations so that they contain their power still. In the Milgram study, for example, Stanley Milgram summarized some very powerful quotes from participants where they said things like, I stopped, but the experimenter kept going. And that really helped to illustrate how helpless they felt. The quotes that were used in the Being Sane in Insane Places article was also intended to provide more power and narrative richness. So you can use quotes, but I do want you to be careful about when you use them. When you are summarizing someone else's research, don't use quotes. No one uses quotes when they're summarizing other people's research. Once again, if someone gives a really great example, then think about it, but really try to avoid using quotes when it's describing other people's research. So once again, when you examine your other sources, so few of them are going to actually include any sort of quotation in them. It's worth it to take a look at other people's writing just to see what's standardized. You want to focus on people's ideas, on their results, rather than their specific wording. and summarizing them in your own words. That's a very valuable skill that I want you to learn how to do. I wanted to briefly address use of I. So I is not forbidden in scientific writing, and it is really awkward when you refer to yourself in the third person, and it's especially awkward when you refer to yourself in the plural. Instead of saying the researchers did this or the researchers did that, say I. If there's multiple people, say we. But if there's only one of you, say I. Don't call yourself the researchers, because that's just weird. By the way, my cat is on my lap right now, and she's purring very loudly. And I don't know if the microphone is going to pick it up or not, but if you do hear a little rumble, that's Sansa saying hello. It's not forbidden, but it should be used sparingly. So think about I as a potential distraction that can express an opinion or a belief rather than a fact, and that the use of it can sometimes make your arguments weaker and can once again take attention away from what the stars of your paper are supposed to be. Logic, reason, and what your participants experience is more important than you. Your ideas should stand up independent of your opinions. So keep in mind that when you have a lot of I in a paper, it becomes all about you, and that if you think a little bit more about supporting your ideas with logic, then it becomes an opinion anyone would come to because it's so strongly supported. It becomes a universal opinion rather than your opinion. So I would say don't tie yourself into knots and be super awkward. You can say I, but think about when you're using it. So for example, if you're writing a sentence that says, I believe that, blah, 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 think about crossing out, I believe that. It often makes the sentence stronger, more definitive, and just a better sentence. So sometimes eliminating yourself from the paper can make it a more weighty, strengthened argument. Typically, I belongs when you're talking about your hypotheses, what you expect to find, and sometimes when you're talking about the procedure and what it is that you did or plan to do during the course of a study. So I really want to see I only when you're talking about your hypotheses and procedure, and to otherwise try to avoid it by focusing in on the ideas that you have as opposed to what you believe. Does that make sense? Think about it a little bit more. Daryl Bem does have a section in his How to Write Scientifically paper about the use of I. There's an entire section of it. So check him out because he actually has some things to say about it that I think would work well for you. So go ahead and look at that a little bit. Very briefly, I wanted to also cover paraphrasing and summarizing, and then a few general tips. So paraphrasing and summarizing. When we are trying to be appropriate with summarizing other sources, you don't just take that author's sentence and replace a word and consider it done. So I just want to make sure that you are being appropriate with your summaries. I am going to have you submit phase 3 through Turnitin, which takes a look at your originality, just as an exercise so that you can make sure that you are adequately summarizing in your own words and not leaning super heavily on what other people say, just replacing a word or two. That's not going to work. So very briefly, paraphrasing is when you rephrase someone else's ideas. It's still using your own words though. So you're not just copying and pasting and then replacing a word here or there. When you're paraphrasing, you take all of their points and you provide all of them and put them in the same order that the author did. So for example, if the author identifies 3 key components of jealousy, then you would provide all 3 of them yourself in the same order that the original author put them in. A paraphrased statement is similar in length to the original phrase that you are putting in your own words. And it's really only used when it's so important to maintain all of the arguments the original source made. So if the original source says point A, point B, point C, point D, and you really want to make sure to maintain all of those because they are all important to your paper, then yeah, you want to go ahead and paraphrase that particular statement. But for the most part, we're going to be summarizing. When you're summarizing, you're taking someone else's idea and condensing it and presenting it in your own words. It tends to be much shorter, and you're picking and choosing what you think is relevant. So if the original author says point A, point B, point C, point D, and you're only interested in point C, you only talk about point C. So you don't have to talk about A, B, and D if it's not relevant. It's much easier to avoid plagiarism when you're summarizing than when you're paraphrasing. So that's just a general note. Some words of wisdom when you're using other people's sources. I would recommend that you talk about it out loud. Talk about it out loud with someone else. You can talk to a roommate or someone over the phone, or have a video conferencing session with me or with a classmate. But often when we talk, we're using a slightly different part of our brains than when we write. And talking actually cuts down on our formality, on how tied we are to jargon. It simplifies our language, and it tends to really cut to the chase. It's a really lovely way to summarize things. Maybe even record yourself talking, because sometimes when we talk about a source, that's actually a really great way to summarize it in our own words. It divorces us from just reading the paper and using those same words. I cannot recommend this enough. Have the original source not directly in front of you when you're writing about it. Just put it aside and see if you can recreate the most important points of it from memory. You can check to make sure that you're correct, but if you have the original source right in front of you, it's just a natural human instinct to use those words and that jargon and pull it over from the original source, which makes it easy to plagiarize unintentionally. So just don't have it right there in front of you. I cannot emphasize this enough. You can express complex ideas in simple, easy to understand language. The best writers are able to do this. And being able to summarize someone else's research using your own simple, easy to understand language really makes it very clear to me that you understand what the source has said and that you've drawn meaning from it. I want your writing to be accessible. I want other people to be able to understand it. Now, not all scientists are good writers. Some of the people that you might have read are terrible at using simple, easy to understand language, but I want you to be better than them. I want you to be accessible. I want your writing to be something that anyone can pick up and understand. And so really kind of think about that as a goal and a value so that you're not using complicated, convoluted language. You're breaking it down into easy concepts so that anyone can understand it. Once again, scientific writing is lean and mean, get to the point, and do it in your own words. Don't depend on other people's jargon. Sometimes when you're having a hard time summarizing a source and doing that from memory, it helps to write out an outline first. Make it very clear when you're using someone else's words and not your own. Put quotation marks around them from the start. And have that be something that's very important. Oh, I almost forgot. I'll make sure to come back to this. But if you do use a quotation in your paper, once again, it needs two key components. The first are little quotation marks before and after. And the second is the addition of the page number as well as the author's last name and year. I'll make sure to touch on that a little bit later too. I completely forgot about that back when we were talking about quotations and when to use them. I was so focused on the spelling part, I didn't focus on the formatting part. Just make sure you, whenever you're using someone else's words, put little quotes around it so you know that they're not your own words, especially when you're working on drafts, because it's so easy to lose that and to forget that you didn't come up with it to begin with, that it came from another source.